Welcome to Unknown Charlotte. My name is Marcel, and this is Steve Matchett.
Hello.
We have the beautiful two Ford GTs in-house, and we wanted to take this moment to give it an overview. And now that I have Steve here, luckily enough, he could give us some background on the racing heritage of these vehicles, and we could go an in-depth dive into either of them.
Well, thank you for that introduction, by the way. It's wonderful, always wonderful to work with you. I have a lot of fun together. Before we start looking at these cars, Marcel, let's just pause for a second just to realize why they exist in the first place.
True.
Okay? If we look behind us here, we see a couple of Ferrari cars.
Oh, yeah.
And it's interesting, I think, that these two Ford GTs exist because of Ferrari in a very direct way. In history, I'm always thinking like every major event in 20th century history can be traced back to the origins of the Great War. And it seems to be the case. And with these two cars, we can absolutely trace their existence back to the time when Ford tried to buy Ferrari in the mid-1960s. Ford wanted to buy the race team, wanted to buy the Maranello road car construction company from Enzo. And at the 11th hour, Enzo Ferrari pulled out and said, you know what, forget it. And that's when Ford said, well, if we can't buy them, we better beat them at their own game, meaning Le Mans, because at that time Ferrari were very, very strong in Le Mans racing, right? And now, because of the Hollywood movie, Ford versus Ferrari, so many more people are aware of all of that.
Yeah.
But it was that decided Ford to build the legendary GT40. Well, we don't have the Ford GT40, but these two cars came about absolutely because of that. And the first one in 2005, known as the Ford GT. Couldn't call the car the Ford GT40 because by that time, that name had been licensed and sold off to somebody else. So Ford weren't allowed to call their own car the GT40. Interestingly, again, remember that the GT40 is so called because of the height of the car from the windscreen here was 40 inches. So, you know, that's the reason. This car was 44 inches, I understand. So could have called it the GT44.
Oh,
they decided not to do that, and they decided to just call it the Ford GT. You know far more about this car, though, as it stands here than I do. Tell me about it.
I mean, when I was a kid, I used to go into the Ford dealerships, and I have seen this vehicle when it was debuted, and it wasn't very popular. It was quite an expensive vehicle for the time, and I didn't see many people having the demand for it. A lot of people honestly did not understand the product. It wasn't a car that could like outright beat the 360 or the 430 in performance standards. So a triple-digit Ford was something that was not very common at the time. Now we have $400,000, $500,000, $600,000, $800,000, $1 million Fords, but back at that time, that was not a very common thing. Much like the Acura NSX, people just didn't understand the product. And I saw this always as the beginning of Ford doing heritage.
Yeah.
The Ford Mustang in 2005 became the fastback, boxy, retro modernization of the brand. And so this came around at the same time. I do know that having them side by side gives me a clear insight as to what the engineering mission brief was. Clearly, this was a road car that then got taken into the track and got raced. This started off as a race car that had to be homologated and had to become as a street car. So they each have their own pros and cons, if you will, but you can see that the engineers aligned it with a different brief in each one of these generations of Ford GTs.
So when this car was first released in 2005, there was what was known as the Heritage Edition, which I think was in Gulf
livery, the orange and the baby blue.
Yes. Yeah. And they surely have soared in value.
Very, very rare to see, though.
Yeah.
Many people know that the only options that existed were 4 options. It was the Macintosh sound system, the BBS racing wheels, the brake caliper colors, and then the stripe. And there's variations of the options, like there's Ford stripe deletes and all that good stuff. But the valuable ones have all the four options installed. And if you have a Gulf livery car, I mean, just expect almost 40 to 50% more than what the value of these are.
Yes, but it's interesting, like my limited knowledge of when these cars were first put on order was to actually buy a Heritage Edition. It wasn't that much of an upgrade in terms of financial input to the car to get it, but boy, you'd be so pleased that you did get it now because it has soared in value as a result of that, way in excess. Although this has got the 4 options on it, right? You talked about the wheels, the calipers, the stripes, and the sound system. This has those 4 options. And again, not a huge amount of extra money to put into the car, but boy, the owners would have been so pleased they had those options on board.
Yeah, and again, it was a product that wasn't really fanfared in the beginning. I think if you look at this vehicle now on paper, you kind of think, oh, it's 550 horsepower, it's manual, it's of 2000s technology, but for them, for Ford, this is a huge step up in the engineering automotive game for them. They didn't have any street cars that had this much leather, that had this much aluminum, that had this much engineering. And there's some kind of exclusive things for this vehicle. This V8, supercharged V8, made itself into GT500s in later generations, but this was the guy that originated that engine, that chassis, that blueprint, all that is coming from them, from this car.
Do you think that, unlike, we just talked about Ferrari, and I've worked with Ferrari for many years, and Ferrari are very good at exploiting their history and their racing legend. We see that all the time with different cars that they produce.
Very romantic.
It's romantic, it's a great legend, and why wouldn't you take advantage of it? And again, with my time in Formula One and talking with the guys from Scuderia Ferrari, they explained to me one day something that completely went over my head until they pointed out. They said, you never see any advertising anywhere else other than the Formula One team and their racing story. You never see an advert, a commercial on the TV for Ferrari. All their sponsorship, all their advertising money goes into the racing team, and from there they make the sales. So my question to you is, do you think Ford were a little bit late to the game, or not as good, or not as forthright in pushing their racing history as other manufacturers were, meaning Ferrari? And so someone decided at Ford, hey, we're missing something here. Like, we had great success with the GT40 in the 60s. Why aren't we doing something with that? Boom.
I think they missed an opportunity in some marketing exploitation. This has a great provenance, a great history of why it exists. Clearly, they took advantage of it in this generation in 2018. I think the world is in a different place now. If you go in social media, you know, I'm lucky to be standing in front of a rare car, but many vehicles in here are rare. We're lucky to see some of this stuff, but the truth is, if you really look at the manufacturing quantities of these vehicles, there's 4,000 and odd of these, there's 1,800 of these. This is the final year for these cars to be manufactured.
Right.
There's a lot more exposure and easier to campaign some of these vehicles through social media, through Cars and Coffee, whatever network that brings us together. But in the 2005 era, 2008 was just 3 years away, and then the housing crisis, the financial crisis hit. Right. This car was an afterthought for everybody who could afford it. No one was really interested in this stuff. It's now that we're into this era of highly digital, turbo, dual clutch, synthesized driving technology that we start looking back and going, holy moly, that was a great car. It was manual, it was V8, it was rear-wheel drive, and it has very little nannies. So that's what I think has happened to this vehicle. Plus, now that I'm coming into age and I saw this vehicle in the dealership, I have the opportunity to aspire to own one. It becomes something that becomes desirable for my generation. So this is something I would love to have, but you know, you have to be in the $1 million mark to start getting into these. Right. This is not that much cheaper. This is half of that, or about 600 to 800, depending on the Gulf ones that you can get. Yeah. But now this is a real proposition, a real enjoyable car that I could actually have modern, but yet old school technology in.
Yeah, I understand exactly what you're saying. When you were explaining that to me, my mind was thinking that's why the F40 has suddenly soared in value in the last few years, because it is really a race car that's made for the road, but it's an absolute analog beast. Yeah. Right? Very few drive rates, nothing on the inside really to help the driver beyond the driver's skill at keeping it under control. So I can see that, and I can see why this car would be successful as well. This car most definitely more represents, from the shape of the car, the original GT40, as we've said. When we look over here at the later version, 2018, it's the front of the car, which I'm sure has been a deliberate thing to styling cues. So they say, okay, well, we can see the GT40 lines in it. But I'll tell you what, if you get back to the center line of the front axle, there's not much left with the original GT40 design back there, is there?
No, you're right. I mean, the whole car acts like a spoiler. The flying buttresses has pushed the cabin inward and very tight. If you look at the Ford GT, it has a very broad cabin. Yeah. This is no longer going to be close to that, because now everything is function first, because we're a race car, and then form second. So you see everything has been placed strategically. I mean, the intercoolers, the cooling fans, all that stuff is right there. And then you have more intercoolers on the side, more intake, more ducting. You open the doors and there's brake duct relief passages even inside the door. So they've gone ahead and made the whole car basically a wing.
Yeah.
To me, it's more airplane than car at this point.
I agree. And when I look at this car, and stick with me on this, but when you look at a modern Formula One car, what the designers of a modern Formula One car want to do is tighten up as much as possible the bodywork behind the cockpit and before the rear wing. And that's exactly what I see here when Ford's engineers have worked on this. You talked about the flying buttresses here, but if you remove this from your vision and just look at the flanks of the car, tightening up as far as possible the bodywork is exactly what Ford have done. And I feel that the main reason they've done that is to feed the rear wing. That's what Formula One is trying to do. And I think that's exactly what the Ford aerodynamicists have been trying to do, the same thing. Because if you can keep the air attached around the flanks of the car, flow it as far as possible as you can, keeping it attached to the car until it starts to speed on the underside of the wing. Well, that's how a rear wing works. If you can have high velocity air underneath, you will start to push the car to the ground. So given free rein, I'm sure many F1 designers would love to copy something like this, but the Formula One regulations don't allow them to do it. It's got to be an open wheel formula. You can't shroud the tires, otherwise they would certainly do so. So I can see instantly the attraction in terms of aero of why the designers and the aerodynamicists have done that. And it's almost like two cars in one, isn't it? Like you look what's happening here.
Yeah, detach the center cabin, like you say.
You're absolutely right. And then you look around
chassis.
here, it looks like two different cars. It's beautiful. It's a real beautiful treatment. Yeah, it's like you say, it's form and function. And when something looks right, it is right. But I can absolutely see that clear line from the underside of the rear wing here to the front fenders is just unbroken all the way back across the car.
Yeah, when I look at this, not knowing anything about aerodynamics, all I could tell is that everything is very deliberate and very well thought of. They just wanted to make sure it performed. And you see it in the taillights. I mean, the taillights have fins and diffusers inside of them, for God's sakes. You see it inside the door panels.
That's right, yeah.
It's everywhere.
Yeah.
Everywhere you see, there's a function before it becomes pretty or anything like that. It's just, it needs to work. And this car is clearly a representation of the success they had on the actual racetrack, because they dominated, they went and won. So how do you stay inactive in any race program for decades and then come back and then win? That's very, very difficult.
It is a big challenge. Let's do this if we've got time. Let's just stop down for a second, undo the engine compartments on both of these cars.
Compare?
Yeah. Can we do that?
Absolutely.
Let's do that.
Here we see a big displacement, 5.4 liter V8 with a supercharger on top. Hell yeah, America!
I'll tell you, I love it. I think it's a beautiful piece of architecture. Earlier on, I mentioned the F40 and that analog driving experience. If we had an F40 alongside us now and the lid would, the clamshell, the lid would lift up the opposite way, but it would look very similar. We see that very similar structure around the car, right at the back.
Right.
The engine moved as far forward to the firewall as possible. Racing technology is racing technology. I love it. I'm intrigued by the fact, but not upset, that Ford decided to use a supercharger on that. That seems an unusual choice to me. Why do you think they did that?
I think in this era, turbocharging wasn't as efficient as it is now. If you had turbo cars in this era, which 911s have been famous for, there was a little bit of a turbo lag. Torque is instant when you have a supercharger, And one of the defining characteristics of any muscle car or American race car is that it's instant torque, heavy torque. Yeah. So supercharger kind of aligned with that.
Yeah.
And I think that's why they did that. This is a very bespoke engine to this vehicle, even though it was used in later Ford Mustangs like the GT500. This started its life as a dry sump engine, all aluminum. And then the supercharged engine was also a new engine at that time. In 2007, they have variations of it. In 2013, there's even facelifts or even updates of this engine. They even bored it out to 5.8 and 640 horsepower in the GT500. But, you know, this is the origin story of those engines. And here, in this chassis, it still has some very unique touches. Again, being all aluminum, there's internal work that is different than the regular Mustangs, and there's the wet sump, dry sump configuration that's different as well. You can't run away from what you were saying though, Steve. The suspension here is 100% race car setup. All these aluminum braces going onto the shock towers, all the engine placement and the transmission or transaxle placement, all that is unique and very race car-like.
I love it. For those of our viewers that are unfamiliar with the difference between superchargers and turbochargers, very briefly, the attraction of a supercharger in terms of its performance on an engine, it is directly driven from the engine. So if you look right at the front of the shaft here, you'll see that there is a composite rubber type belt that is being driven off a pulley, and that's turning the supercharger. So you're right, when you talk about the lack of lag, turbo lag is the big problem with turbos, or was it historically. Right. The supercharger doesn't have it because it's mechanically driven from the engine. Right. There's a big attraction to that. The downside of that, unfortunately, in terms of racing desirability, is you're taking horsepower away from the engine to drive the supercharger.
Right, to turn the supercharger vane, which is inside the supercharger.
You're sapping power.
It takes power to turn that, so therefore it takes power to make power.
Yeah, and when we look at the car behind us, we'll see, there's not an awful lot to see in there because it's so enclosed because of aero reasons, but Ford on the later edition decided, let's do away with the supercharger and we'll put turbos on. So the benefit of a turbo and the downside of a turbo, the benefit, it's being driven by exhaust gases. So we're not really sapping energy, direct energy taken from the engine, because we're using recycled gases that otherwise would just be thrown away, right? So there's the advantage. The downside, historically, we just touched on it earlier on, is when you open the throttle, there is that period of time known as lag before the turbo realizes it's got to wake up and do some work, right? Because it's only being driven by gases. So there's no direct connection. The way around that in racing was to, well, there are several ways around it, but not having a big unit is an easy solution. That, like, the smaller you can make that turbo,
the faster it spools up.
There's less weight in there, and the faster it'll spool up. So that was one answer to it. So again, going back to the conversation when we just started, I'm surprised to see it on a supercharger, but I like it. You know, I think that's it's a great thing, and I also like, I like the fact that this car doesn't have it. Now, I like the fact that the engineers at Ford are thinking, well, there's two ways of putting extra power into this. It can be this, or it can be that. You know? I like that.
And lightness was the brief here, right? Yeah. Race car was the brief. So you have to start with a smaller engine. So it's a V6. It's smaller displacements, 3.5 liters. And then let's throw turbos on it. With a dual clutch transmission, also being lighter than a regular manual transaxle, they have trickeries to make the turbo spool up faster than you could ask for that boost to come on. So it's seamless nowadays.
Let's have a walk over to this car and show me this one. Well, again, in terms of its engine and power plant, there's not an awful lot for us to see at first glance because it's hidden.
You can see the dry sump reservoir there, made in cast aluminum, and then you see the rest of it is all carbon fiber surrounding it. This car is entirely built out of carbon fiber, chassis and body. So all you can see is basically top of the valve covers. I can maybe see the high pressure fuel pumps from here, and that's as far as my eyes can go.
That's about it. There is very, very little to see. And in terms of serviceability, well, you're going to have to take half of this car apart to be able to get to it and work on it. But that's okay. You know, there are two things you've got to look out for in racing, I would say, is one, you know, you want it to be as efficient as possible, and that's why the car looks like this. But if you need to make a repair, and certainly in endurance racing, you can get involved in some fairly lengthy repairs, but you've got to be able to service the car. Yeah. If you can service something in 5 minutes rather than 15 minutes, well, there's a 10-minute advantage on the track. Right. Well, where else are you going to find that? To gain 10 minutes sometimes is a huge thing. Now, again, Le Mans racing, endurance racing, is not my history. My history is Ferrari road cars and Formula One. But I think, Marcel, that the reason that this little compartment exists here, and this little tool package exists here, if memory serves, to Le Mans regulations, if the car stops on track, the driver cannot receive any outside assistance, and also all repairs that he makes must be done with tools that he carries on board, he or she.
Oh, that's what you think?
So I
that's why they had
believe,
that?
I'm not sure, but I believe that's why this compartment exists and why the little tool roll exists, because that allows the driver to have some chance of doing something to the car. But I think that's a requirement to the Le Mans regulation.
It's very cool. And again, you also see how things start off purpose-built and end up on road cars. And you and I are here pondering it, but they all start with function first.
Function first is exactly right. But again, it just goes to show how over the years, we'll say aero is king in race car design. Everything is subservient to the desires of the aerodynamicists, quite frankly, because it's such a performance advantage to come from harnessing the airflow. And that has led to this, that has led to this shape, it's led to the wing being here, all of that. The flank treatments we talked about earlier on, it's airflow, 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 and then make the thing reliable.
One big thing that we never get to see here when you're looking at a vehicle is, well, I get to see a lot of it because I service a lot of these vehicles, but if you put these cars up in the air, you get to see so much more refinement that happens over the years with aerodynamics. The underplatings all have venting, NACA ducting, and active aero flaps where they actually open and close depending on what you're asking the car to do. That was not an option or anything that existed in the early 2000s. So
that realm of engineering, aerodynamic sophistication, came on so fast. I was involved in Formula One with Benetton in the 1990s. And when I first started in January 1990, looking at the B190, the B191, and upwards through the range, very little consideration was given to airflow treatment underneath the engine cover. Over the top, we'd all figured that out by then. We've got to control the airflow over the top. But literally in the space of 2 or 3 years, as much attention was given to the airflow underneath the engine cover, the flow of air through the radiator cooling matrices around the engine, around the transmission coolers, and out the back and around the wing. That was given as much consideration as the outside. But to go on what you're saying, the underneath of the car is given so much more sophistication. Nothing, and it kind of stands to reason really, but nothing can be overlooked.
yeah.
Because if we were two different constructors, if we were competition, like I would try something, you've got to try the same, otherwise you're going to be slower on track. I see what you're doing, I've got to copy it.
Right. To be competitive, you have to constantly evolve and constantly move in the direction to be better.
Exactly right. Yeah. Well, these are two beautiful cars, and I say congratulations to Ford for producing the original GT40. That's a beautiful race car in every way. It does everything that it should, that it says on the can, as they say. Then producing this, the legendary, the Ford GT from 2005, to this wonderful race car, the Ford GT of 2018. It's been an absolute thrill to see these with you. Thanks very much.
Yeah, it's been my pleasure. I constantly have to pinch myself. Not only that I get to work with you, but I get to be surrounded by my greatest colleagues and the greatest vehicles ever produced. It's a real privilege and an honor, actually.
Thanks again.
Cheers.